Today, on June 20th, we mark First Peoples Sunday, recognizing that tomorrow, June 21st, across Canada, is First Peoples Day. We acknowledge with respect the history, spirituality, and culture of the Mississauga peoples with whom the Williams Treaty of 1923 was signed, and the territory wherein this church building resides. We acknowledge our responsibility as treaty members. We also acknowledge that relationships have been broken and that we must work together to build respectful relationships with all of our brothers and sisters. We light the Christ candle this morning, recognizing the presence of God in Christ with us. I'd also like to point out that the beautiful artistry depicting creation from a First Peoples or Indigenous point of view was designed by Ben Jacobs, who is of the Six Nations community near Brantford. Let us pray. Holy One, we gather to share in your abundant gift of life for all. We fix ourselves on you, Creator. Come, fill our hearts with your endless love and send the wind of your Spirit to new hope through our lives. Come, light our souls to rise in faith and to reach out for your reign. Come, pour out your Spirit upon us as we stand together as sisters and brothers. Lift up our heads, brush away the shadows, and shine your grace into our minds. And so, Creator, we worship you. We shake off the shackles of a fallen world and join our hearts together. With gratitude, we gather as a community in praise, Creator, to seek transformation and to celebrate the power of your Spirit that is always moving. Amen.
Find the frame where we are free.
Our scripture reader today is Shirley Mavis.
Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story, those he redeemed from the hands of the foe, those he gathered from the lands, from east and west, from north and south. Some went out on the sea in ships. They were merchants on the mighty waters. They saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep, for he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. In their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunkards. They were at their wits' end. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. Let them exalt him in the assembly of the people and praise him in the council of the elders.
And now I invite you to enjoy our special musical offering. Our soloist is Ruth Varkas, and she's singing Shelter Me.
Trusting that
In your mercy you have sheltered me. Oh, shelter me. Oh, shelter me. The way ahead is dark and difficult to see. Oh, shelter me. Oh, shelter me. All will be well if only you will shelter me. All will be well if only you will shelter me. Well, I'm very happy to introduce Petra Richardson to you. I knew her as Petra Sievert all my life, from the time she was a weensy teensy baby. But maybe you can talk a little bit more about that, Petra, how we know each other.
Yes. Well, thank you for having me. And I wanted to say that I too have known you since I was an eensy weensy teeny baby, but I'm happy to call you my big sister.
And that's been a beautiful relationship for us since you were born. You've been a part of my family. And it's been, well, may I say, over 50 years. And yeah, but you recently made connections with another family. Tell me a bit about that.
Yes. During the searches that I've done, I have found my birth family, which turns out to be Indigenous. Now, knowing,
surprise, right?
no, it wasn't a big surprise. I had known all my life that I was Indigenous. I didn't really necessarily, I was fascinated by that side of myself. I found that it was an interesting story to me, if that makes sense. Like, but I never really connected in any way, shape, or form in the Indigenous community.
And so, how did that change?
Well, I think getting to know this extended family, I realized that there's so much a part of history that I don't even understand or know about. And with every good story, there's a sad story, which has been hard for me to deal with, in the fact that I never felt any prejudice for being Indigenous that I really recall.
Yeah.
And to hear the stories from even my family members now, that the hardships that they went through is mind-boggling.
Can you just mention one or two areas of hardship, Petra?
A lot of it had to do with not having the education on the reserves, particularly up north in Saskatchewan. So a lot of those, even to this day, the teenagers have to come down from the reserve and go to cities, often staying with people they don't know. And I feel at their most vulnerable time, when they're 12 and 13, mostly high school age, that they're entering a part where they don't have the support that they actually need to carry on. And even part of my family members have moved off the reserve so that her children wouldn't have to live amongst strangers, because it was not a good experience for her herself.
Okay. What about the way that you were greeted by these relative strangers when you made the decision to go out and meet them?
Wow, that was breathtaking and overwhelming, and they welcomed me with open arms. There was 40 people there, and children and elders and uncles and cousins, and as you know, coming from a smaller family here in Canada, to suddenly having this large, huge embrace was overwhelming.
That's a beautiful thing. Had you ever thought about First Peoples Day in relation to yourself before you met your Indigenous family?
No, not particularly. In fact, when I was doing a little bit of research and things like that, I found out that it's 25 years old already. And so no, it never dawned on me. It almost felt like it was something not for me. You
And
know, not in the fact that I didn't know I was Indigenous, but the fact that I wasn't raised in an Indigenous community made me almost wary, or that I was accepting something that wasn't mine.
sort of like the idea of appropriation. And I think,
Yeah.
for example, my heritage is obviously settler, and I'm very careful when I use Indigenous language or metaphors that I'm not appropriating something that doesn't belong to me. Is that sort of the feeling that you had, or not?
Yes. Yes, it was um, because I was raised in the settler community and way of life. I didn't feel this was something that I was deserving of. That
Interesting.
I,
Interesting. Yeah. Okay.
yeah, that I had. So even though it's in my heritage, I didn't recognize any part of that as being a part of myself.
And now, does that still feel the same or not?
It's changing, and I think my extended family meeting my extended family makes me more aware that I have ancestry, and those ancestors paved the way for today, the Indigenous people, to have a voice, to have their story told, to have their lives recognized. And I'm feeling more of a part of that because hearing the stories from the extended family.
Okay. So the term respectful relationships, it's a way for settler people like me to improve relationships with Indigenous people. There's been so much hurt and so much history that's painful. Are there any suggestions that you would have? I mean, you and I have a bond and we can talk openly about any of this. If I
For
go
sure.
and meet your family, and apparently they'd love to meet me,
Yes, they would.
yeah, what kind of attitude, approach helps respectful relationships in your mind?
Um, I think it's a walk softly approach. Being open to different cultures, different foods, different spirituality, different, and accepting, trying, and honestly saying, I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend. If I do say something that's wrong, could you please correct me? Or, you know. Even in my family, they call it we're Dene, and which used to be Chippewa, which apparently is not it's derogatory. They don't even know why it's derogatory, but it is. So we're Dene of the Indigenous community.
Right. Okay. And have you got a phrase in Dene that you learned?
Well, I did, and my extended family will be very disappointed that I can't remember it right offhand. Because they were throwing it, but they quickly downloaded an app for me so that I could slowly start to learn the Dene language.
That's beautiful. Petra, I am so glad that your connecting with your Indigenous family has been such a rich experience for you. And I hope that as you get to know them more, your life just becomes richer and richer. And that hopefully people like me can help to build some bridges. I really appreciate your honesty and your vulnerability for doing this. Is there anything you wanted to add that I haven't asked you about?
I would love, as I'm starting to learn the culture, someday maybe we could do a retreat together that we can take a group of women or men and introduce them to the culture and have a wonderful time and see the aurora borealis as well.
Oh, that sounds absolutely perfect. Thank you, Petra.
Thanks.
On this weekend where we recognize National Indigenous Peoples Day, and in fact, National Indigenous Peoples Month, I'd like to share with you the 7 grandfather teachings that come through from the elders in many Indigenous communities. It's not surprising, perhaps, that they are very similar to the gifts recorded in Scripture of the fruits of the Spirit. And so there are 7 grandfather teachings that people lived by daily as laws. The first is love. Love is to know the Creator. Therefore, it's expected one's first love is for that of the Creator. Love for the Creator extends to love for all the Creator's children. The second is respect. Respect is the condition of being honored. Respect is a belief that no one person is more important than another. Respect is also recognizing the value of each human being and each creature. Courage. Courage is the ability to face danger, fear, or change with confidence and bravery. Living in the heart and spirit is difficult, but we can face any danger to achieve courage in our lives. Honesty is speaking and acting truthfully, thereby remaining morally upright. The elders said, live true to your spirit and never try to be someone else. The fifth is wisdom. Wisdom is the ability to make decisions based on personal knowledge and experience. When used properly, one's gifts contribute to the development of a peaceful and healthy being and community. Humility is recognizing and acknowledging that Creator is a higher power than people. This is truly humbling. True humility is not being arrogant. To capture true humility, one must express deference or submission to the Creator. The expression of humility bows its head in acknowledgement of others. And finally, truth. Truth is to know and understand all the original laws given by the Creator and to remain faithful to them. Truth is essential to the well-being of both the heart and the community. You may wonder why I've chosen a bowl of strawberries to represent the 7 grandfather teachings. I do so because for many, this weekend marks the Festival of First Fruits, a celebration of the return of produce from the earth to sustain and nourish us, to chase away the dried and preserved taste of winter, and enjoy the sweet taste of rain and sunshine and God's abundance provided for us on this earth.
Well, and I have the opportunity now to speak with Jessica. Now, do you pronounce it Outram or Outram?
Outram.
Outram. All right. And Jessica and I had the opportunity to meet in, actually, it was more than one production of the VOS, Amateur Dramatic Society, based here in Cobourg. So, Jess, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, the things that matter most to you, how you spend your time, that sort of thing.
Okay. Well, I do remember fondly us working on a show together, and your wonderful piano skills and how you helped me to learn a song. And I was just so grateful for that. So since then, that was a while back. Since then, I'm just finishing my 2nd year as the Poet Laureate of Cobourg. And I'm really enjoying that. What a wonderful way to connect with the community through the arts and through poetry. And I'm also a citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario. And I want to maybe clarify for people what that means. Because sometimes people have questions, even people in my own family will have questions around what is a Métis identity and what does that mean? So my family comes from has the roots in the Georgian Bay Métis community. And my parents live there today. And in fact, they live a kilometer by water from where my grandfather grew up. My grandfather was raised in a lighthouse. And
that's such a cool thing. When I read that on Facebook, I went, wow,
I know.
I gotta talk to this woman.
So interesting. And they lived at the lighthouse, 2 generations. Well, 3 generations lived there, but 2 generations of keepers for 60 years. And we're there a long time. So I'm the first generation on my mother's side to grow up away from the water. Although, in Cobourg, I'm lucky that Lake Ontario is close by. And I have to say that was a big pull for me in coming here. So, to trace the roots back even further, my family's from Michilimackinac, or the Mackinac area in Michigan. And there was a Métis community there, and they fought with the British during the War of 1812. And then they were moved from there after that, as they were drawing the borders and the boundaries around what was the United States and Canada. The British moved them to St. Joseph's Island in Michigan. Okay. And then they said, nope, that's not good. That's not ours. Then they moved them to Drummond Island, and then they were there for 5 or 10 years. And then they had them move again to Penetanguishene, and they removed them and said, if you want to continue your alliance with us, and they did, because, the War of 1812 was still very fresh, and that's kind of the decision that they had made, is they moved a whole group of voyageurs and their families, this Métis community, to Penetanguishene. And there's a wonderful oral account of that journey by Louis Solomon, who's a great ×4 uncle of mine. And there's even a picture of him that's quite fascinating. And so they landed in Penetanguishene, and they were given little plots of land. So the European settlers were given larger, more lush plots of land in the area. And this Métis community were given these small plots of land. And my family anyways, they were fishermen and voyageurs and lived on the water and moved around they didn't know how to farm. And so that didn't last long. They were very poor. There was nothing. So they ended up, and again, a number of the families ended up moving north along Georgian Bay to this Bing Inlet community. And then my great grandfather became, his father became lighthouse keeper at Giroux Island Lighthouse. And then that kind of just leads you to today. So to be Métis, you need to have links to a historic community. Sometimes people will say, well, you've had a European ancestor married a First Nations ancestor. And yes, that happened along the way, but then they formed a distinct community. And then there's actually this is all on my mother's side, there's one Métis person will marry another Métis person, and then now you're connected to two different Métis lines. And we're very close to the different First Nation communities that were there. So I really loved learning about all of that history, and feel a great responsibility to share the story, and to, I try to, as often as I can, find those opportunities to talk about it, because growing up, we weren't allowed to.
I'm sorry, I'm going to stop you there.
Yeah.
Okay, you are a wordsmith, a storyteller. That must have been very hard. I imagine that there are ancestors of yours who were also storytellers. To not be able to tell your story, what was that all about? What was that like? How did it impact your family?
Those are big questions. I think, big questions. I think it impacted in terms of just a disconnection, right? They had to change their name. The name was changed from Normandin to Lemondin. They changed the family narrative, and my mom grew up being told that she was from Normandy, France. Any time that they asked about any connections to the First Nations communities that were nearby, they were told no. And there was, I think, just a lot of disconnection from all of that, and a lot of denial and quiet from that. So some of the traditions were lost. Things weren't named or labeled the way that we would today. But some of the traditions still carried on, which I find really fascinating, even to the point where I was at the Peterborough Canoe Museum in this section about the Métis people, and there was a song on the wall that my mom sang to me as a child. Now, if I asked her, she would not say it was a Métis song. That's not how she would define it. But it stunned me that it was on the wall, this song.
That must have been one of those tingle at the back of your neck moments.
Absolutely. And, when I grew up, going up there, because again, my parents still live there, but going up there every summer, most weekends, and we would have big family picnics out on the islands, in and around where Henvey Inlet is, and out on Georgian Bay, not far from the lighthouse. And so, I feel grateful that those traditions were passed down. But there's also a deep sense of sadness and a sense of disconnect, because there's things that we don't know that we weren't allowed to ask. And my grandparents passed away quite early. Like, my parents lost their parents before they were in their mid-20s. And so my great aunt Bernice was probably the closest one that was a grandparent to me, and she would come stay with us for a month in the summer. And but she wouldn't ever talk about it. It was very hard. I would follow her around with my notebook, asking her questions, and you know, and you could see it in her face, and you know, but she would deny it and just talk about Normandy.
Why? Who told her that? Who's responsible for suppressing the story?
I think it was the family themselves. There must have been, and again, I don't know the answers as to why. I find history can be complex, and we're just constantly in a state of asking questions about why, right? Why?
I'm going to pause because of the train. I just paused for a second there because of the train, so I wasn't cutting Jessica off. We've been talking about the story of your family and it being suppressed, whether that was done by your family by choice, whether they were told to. There's no way to know, but it's not a heritage from Normandy. And you've found that out through some of the records of your great uncle 4 times passed or whatever, or
it all started with me constantly asking the question since I was a child: who grows up in a lighthouse?
Right.
Right, like that was my big question. You know, I'm here, I am in school, and we're having these projects talking about where we're from, and I couldn't in my brain connect. How do you? And I would say to my mom, how do you go from France to a lighthouse? Where what is that connection? And for 60 years I just couldn't figure that out. And then the other piece is my grandmother was French Canadian, and her French was very different than the other, my grandfather's family, and we would hear about that. And so, well, really, I didn't know my grandfather as well, but I knew his brother, Uncle Ernest, my great Uncle Ernest, well, and his French was just different than anything I'd ever heard of before. And so, you know, I wondered about, you know, and his French and his English too. And I just loved him to pieces. I loved them all. But, you know, I started asking those questions. And then as the internet expanded, thank goodness for that, I spent hours and hours Googling my family name to find stories, and trying to find out more about the lighthouse and what the connections were. And then Ancestry was created, and you could start tracking your family tree. And then my Aunt Estelle and I went to the archives in Ottawa, and there's a Voyageur database, and we learned how to use that. And we were able to even find the boats that they were on and what they carried. And so it just was like pulling a thread, and then all of these pieces started unraveling. But, you know, they just continue to unravel, I find, with every conversation that I have with family. And it's really nice to be in a position like this is me, the optimist, where I can talk about it, I can learn about it, and I can ask questions. Whereas again, that conversation was not entertained when I was a kid, and I would start asking those questions. It was not something like Aunt Bernice would talk about. My mom was not like it, and she just didn't. Well, why would we talk about it? Let's just move on. But you know, it's.
So, Jessica, that brings me to, I guess, exploring a question of identity.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense that your identity experience with the Métis community is different than your mother, your grandmother, your Aunt Bernice?
Well, certainly my mother was raised and grew up in Brit, and my aunts and my Aunt Bernice. So my family moved to that area in the 1860s. And then it wasn't until the 1970s, so over 100 years, they lived in that area. And then prior to that, like I said, was Penetanguishene, and then up north. I've always felt some sort of deep connection. And again, these deep questions and this calling to do this work around reclaiming our family stories and then reflecting them back to the family. And certainly, you know, my aunt and my mom, they grew up in a one-street town. When the highway that goes through to Sudbury, I don't think it was built until the mid-50s. So, you know, when my aunt was growing up, there wasn't a highway. My dad will talk about how they had to take the train to go and get food. It was a very remote location, and it still is a pretty remote location to live in today. So there's all of those pieces that would be very different than my upbringing growing up in Southern Ontario, right? Like just landscape.
Yeah.
But I feel such a deep connection to that land. And I feel that, you know, our family picnics that we would have, that I knew other families weren't having, like, and these were very special, specific picnics where we'd fish and we'd swim. There's always a sing song. There was music. My mom learned the accordion as a child. You know, someone would bring out their guitar and we would all sing for hours into the night. So again, I think some of those traditions got passed down. The other wonderful tradition that we had was my mom and her sisters started having a girls' week up at my parents' place every year. And then when we came of age, they invited us. And so, you know, without naming it, this is what I'm saying, without naming it or labeling or knowing what it was, there was naturally things that were happening within our family around having us as the young cousins and all the women having, you know, that time a week each year where our mothers and their two sisters and us, so there was, you know, 6 or 7 of us would just spend a week together in the wilderness, in the family landscape, talking and getting to know each other and then learning from each other's wisdom. So some of the stuff, you know, it just happens, no matter what you're calling it, right?
Yeah, you absorb it that way. It's not an intentional taught lesson. It's experiencing, and as you say, wisdom shared without anyone saying, this is what we're going to talk about today.
Right. And then we have such a deep love of the land.
Yeah.
That's up there, and you know, and you know, I can acknowledge that it's the land of the Anishinaabe people. Those are the first people that were there, and it's just such a beautiful landscape that I have to go there every summer just to feel whole and to feel that connection and to feel right with things. And I can't get that anywhere here.
No. Yeah, I understand. I understand what you're saying. One of the things I often speculate about, because it actually happened for me in the eastern part of Germany, to be in a location where I had been before. It was kind of weird, but it's this whole business of memory being encapsulated in DNA. And I think it's fascinating to think all of the things we inherit in terms of instinct and knowledge, and to think that some of that memory might be there. I've always romanticized the Voyageur. There's something about the hardiness, what seems on the surface to be an unfettered life, where you move on the water and you sleep on the land, and then you move on the water and you sleep on the land. And I think that the Canadian story has romanticized the Voyageur, and I think left out a lot of the negative parts of the story. When I was a girl growing up, we traveled a lot across Canada, and the Voyageur restaurant was a safe haven that you just knew you could go in. But there was nothing that was a trace of Indigenous, Métis, anything that earned the name Voyageur. You know, it was your hot beef sandwich.
Was that in Perry, like north of Perry Sound?
Oh, Perry Sound, but also north of Perry Sound, certainly, but also going out west. There's still one Voyager motel left. I was in it last summer, North Shore of Lake Superior. But
I think the kids' food came in a boat.
you know, I think you're right.
Yeah, I remember going there as a kid, and the kids' food came in like this cardboard boat.
The things we remember, eh?
Yeah.
It's First Peoples Day on Monday. It's also solstice. It's also Festival of First Fruits for many Indigenous people. It is a day that's recognized in the Northern Hemisphere as a day of fertility, of high energy, and it was named by the Government of Canada as First Peoples Day. I think now we would use the phrase Indigenous peoples more and more, but do you think it has meaning and relevance today? It's 20 years old. Has it made a difference? Does it matter what we call a day like that?
Well, I feel like I think the government's calling it National Indigenous Peoples Day.
Okay, the calendars haven't caught up to that yet.
That's the government website. And I think that it's important to certainly have more than one day. We have a lot of learning that we need to do in Canada. These are not easy times for many. There's a lot that's coming up in the news, and these are stories that people have known. But for some, it's catching their attention for the first time in a different way. So having a day like National Indigenous Peoples Day is good because it can help us to renew our commitment to learning more. Because I think that that's the first step. Even for me, I need to learn more about who I am and my roots, and to share those stories, what I know when I know it, and it will continue to grow and evolve. But we have so many distinct Indigenous stories and perspectives in Canada, and every story is different, even within the Métis Nation.
Sure.
My Métis story as a descendant of the Drummond Island Voyageurs is very different than the Métis people of the Red River settlement.
Right.
And kind of honoring that and learning those stories, I think is really important, because they've been overlooked for such a long time or skimmed over. And they're going to continue to get our attention until we really stop and take it in, and then change things. So on a day like today, like that, it's a day of reflection and expanding our critical consciousness, asking those questions, welcoming the discomfort that comes, because when you're feeling uncomfortable, you know you're in the right place, because it shouldn't always feel comfortable. And like I said, there is a lot of work that we need to do in our communities. There's a lot of work that needs to be happening in our schools, in our businesses, in our institutions, to really understand who we are, why we're here, whose lands are we on, you know, and what was the cost, and recognizing and acknowledging that, I think is really important. So I really hope that other people will take that action on a day like today, to be reflective and to make that commitment to just as a start to learn more.
And then I guess I have been advised that a good phrase to use as we move forward. I mean, we're so far away from truth and reconciliation. There needs to be truth telling, but there's a lot of that has to happen before we can even begin to move towards genuine reconciliation. There's so much hurt. So I've been told that a good phrase to use is respectful relationships. That for settler folk like me, And also, let's face it, a church heritage and everything else that was definitely part of dominant culture. That I try. I try very hard, and I hope that this can be the beginning of conversations where we come to the table and where settlers listen and Indigenous peoples speak, which is a real turnaround, right? Yeah, because that has not been the model. What do you think would help most in terms of respectful relationships with Indigenous peoples?
I think it's that commitment to learning and to listen, like you mentioned, is really important. To find ways for authentic voices to share their stories, to recognize in our own community we have a number of people with Indigenous histories to tell, and how can we find ways to to listen when they're wanting to speak. We also don't want to push our agenda on anyone either, and then to take that action. And we always need to begin with ourselves, and who we are, and really get an understanding of who we are within the context of where we live and who we interact with. And then we need to look, like I said, at the systems that we're part of and what needs to be shifted and changed. And I'm always an optimist, and I know even in my own family, something that has started as a conversation that was not to be had has shifted to, now my brother has he's a citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario. My nephew as well. My nephew's learned how to finger weave, and he's made his own vest. My cousin is working for the Métis Nation of Ontario this summer. She's just finished her first year in university, and she's learning all sorts of wonderful traditional skills through that and engaging with youth across the province. I've got other cousins. I get calls all the time from cousins who say, I've been thinking a lot about what you said, and I would really like to learn more. Can you teach me? And so it's really lovely to have been in this position, to have found the family story and unearthed it and connected it. And then the healing that can come just even one person at a time, sharing that out. And then over time, they'll get more comfortable. Like right now, we're just starting with sharing it within our own family.
Yes.
I don't know how many would be comfortable to come on a video and talk about our family history.
Understood.
So it's kind of starting there with ourselves. And even my mother, I love her to pieces. And she even said today on the phone, don't forget this summer when you come, you're going to help me with my paperwork so that I can get my Métis citizenship. So she's ready, right? So it's to me that's that sense of connection and that sense of pride and that sense of saying this is who I am is a first start. And what we need to do as a community, I think, is to create those safe spaces for people to be who they are, and to build those relationships of trust by just being open and welcoming to meeting people where they are on the journey, because the journey is very complex. And my family story doesn't have the pieces that other Indigenous family stories have, doesn't have, the connections to residential schools in the same way, or some of the other traumatic pieces that come along with that. And so each story is different, and everybody's in a different place with connecting to that.
You're the community poet laureate. I happen to be a spiritual leader in the community. I would like to think that perhaps in the not too distant future, you and I could maybe work together to get some story sharing happening. I would love that opportunity.
Wonderful. That would be wonderful. And I could share with you a poem right now if you.
I think that would be a beautiful thing. Jessica, I'm going to let you have the last word. I am going to hide myself from this and let you, as Poet Laureate of Cobourg, close out this interview. Thank you so much for being a part of this. I've really loved it. And the honesty and vulnerability and trust that you've offered here today means so much to me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, so my poem is about the sash. So this is the Métis sash. You may have seen this before, and typically a woman will wear the sash over their shoulder like this. And the sash is also known as the Assumption sash from Assumption, Quebec, but it's become a symbol of the Métis Nation. And it was a tool that was used by voyageurs. And they could wrap it around their waists when they were doing heavy portages. They could use the threads to do some sewing. They could tie things to it. And each color in the sash can represent a different thing. And so I wrote a poem about the story of the sash kind of through my eyes. And so the poem is called The Story of the Sash. She began with each thread, finger weaving stories, fights on red roads seeped down into ancestral webs, plants and trees grown for ceremony, an abundance of green. Gold resilience glistened on generations, later born again in names reclaimed. Blue spirits sang and danced, all families welcomed to their fish fry. She lit white sky candles to feed the longing to understand. And when the black shadow of loss pierced their homes, her fingers counted everything taken. Come back, Métis and Anishinaabe mothers. Braid your knowledge into these waterways, stitch this land that cries out for healing. Bind these stories with your distinction, this sash an offering for every gift and sacrifice. In Michif, we say thank you by saying merci. So merci, thank you so much. And hope you have a wonderful day.
As we join together in our prayers of the people today, Debbie and I invite you to join us on the refrain that comes from More Voices 151, and it echoes a line from the Lord's Prayer, "Your will be done on earth, O God." 151 in More Voices. We will sing it once at the beginning of the prayer, and then we will sing it again until we have finished all of the stanzas of our prayer, closing with the refrain and moving into the Lord's Prayer that we will say together. Holy One, on this day where we remember First Peoples Day, where we remember the sacred grandfather teachings, and where we hold up that which is good and true and beautiful in the lives of our fathers and our ancestors, we come together asking that your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We ask this in particular in relationship to the way that we love. We remember also that those who have expressed love have sometimes done so in hurtful ways. We also remember that abuse has sometimes been called an act of love. And so we ask God that all who have suffered in the name of so-called love find healing, and that all who claim to act in love do so with genuine charity in their heart. We ask that the bonds of love that we have in families and in communities thrive. In order for that love to thrive, God, we also remember the teaching on respect, and that without respect there can be no fullness of life or fullness of relationship. And finally, God, we ask for courage. Courage to face the things that have caused us pain in the past. Courage to find room for forgiveness, and courage to change. Creator, we also ask that we may be given true and right spirits within us. Help us to cultivate the spirit of honesty, even when it might be easier to tell a white lie. Help us in that honesty also to speak the truth to others in love, and yet acknowledge how we truly feel. Give us a spirit of wisdom, that as we move forward from this day, we do so in ways that reveal your reign and not our will. And finally, God, we also ask for a spirit of humility, acknowledging that each one of us, no matter our intentions, has the capacity to hurt others, and that only you are the Creator, only you are true wisdom, only you are true love. Creator, we also ask that a spirit of truth might guide us in all our undertakings as individuals and as a faith community, and in wider relations with all our relations, particularly those who are our Indigenous brothers and sisters. We do pray that there may be a time of reconciliation between settlers and Indigenous peoples and all peoples of this our home and native land. God, we ask that whatever small steps we can make, that it would be you that holds our hand as we take those steps in faith and in commitment to your will. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Cale, welcome. It's a delight to have you participate in this exploration of the event of First Peoples Day, and thank you so much for agreeing to talk about yourself. And
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're very welcome. I'm just wondering if we could maybe start, Cale, with you talking a little bit about yourself, your life. You and I first met when you came with your guitar and your wonderful recording pedal device, doing all kinds of backbeats and accompanying yourself for a Syrian refugee event. And I remember how impressed I was, not just with your music, but with your personality and your presence. So as a result, I felt I'd love to talk to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself now, Cale.
Cool. So my name is Cale Crowe. I am an Indigenous singer-songwriter from Alderville First Nation. And as you said, I was first invited to the church through this event to help benefit Syrian refugees, which, God, that must be years and years and years ago now. Yeah, it was a lovely experience. And yeah, I've been performing professionally as a musician since 2013. So my 10,000 hours surely must be coming up at some point. And yeah, I'm a graduate of Durham College, and I have been performing pretty much anywhere between Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Sydney, Nova Scotia, over the past 10 years. So, and people are always so fascinated by the fact that I am able to do this for a living and yet still not be, I don't know, everyone has their own idea of what a touring professional musician should look like. But I'd like to think that I've been able to sort of help break down that stereotype about the typical rock star life, I guess. So yeah, that's pretty much me in a nutshell.
Okay, thanks. So maybe we could go into some specifics then. Alderville First Nation is your home, if not always, in fact, certainly spiritually. Tell me a little bit about your sense of being an Indigenous person in our society, in your experience, how you feel about it.
Right. So I have grown up on my reservation all my life. It's always sort of been home, I guess. And I've lived in multiple places. Like right now I live in Cobourg. I've lived in Peterborough before, Oshawa, Toronto, and everywhere didn't quite feel completely like home, obviously, just because of that. I've always had that sort of down home identity, kind of like, what I imagine a lot of people living out this way have, living in small towns and hamlets and things like that. But when I was growing up, I was, Alderville is sort of adjacent to Roseneath. And so I grew up attending Roseneath School. And there was always not quite the biggest divide between the students. We were certainly the minority of students, yes, in every grade, but when it only ever reared its ugly head, the differences between us for a small time, and then people mature, and I always, I'm a firm believer that things like racism are taught at home. primarily, whether it's, you know, from your own parents or what you see on TV or whatever. Like, I think racism in that form is always taught at home. And so, you know, kids would come from school or from home to school, and, you know, they would have heard someone at home say something like wagon burner, or you know, it's just stupid things like that. So and so I have very distinct memories of these insults being hurled at us from, you know, voices that didn't quite understand what they were saying at the time, right? And I've had a few experiences where those people have come back in their adulthood and have been like, look, man, I was really stupid, like I didn't really know what I was saying or doing. So, but yeah, there's always sort of been a feeling of difference, and I mean difference as in like, you know, like going to high school in Cobourg, you know, there was always a sense of, you know, being blended into a crowd, but knowing that you were still different. And obviously I have a pretty unique experience with that, just because I have, you know, pale European complexion compared to some of my friends from back home. But you know, it was always sort of this difference, and I was never made to feel too, you know, I was never made to feel too aware of it from my friends, which I was very fortunate to have experienced, you know, feeling welcomed and things like that. So obviously, and that comes with maturity and time, right? So
Sure.
but yeah, in terms of just general what it means to me, I mean, it's the same as any culture, I imagine, where, you know, you feel a sense of pride in where you come from. And I mean, hopefully you feel a sense of pride in where you come from. And yeah, I've never thought differently about any of my practices or any of my beliefs. You know, like I feel like I'm one of those sort of live and let live people, where everyone has their own thing, and whatever works for you, and whatever works for me. And so I was never made to feel weird about anything that happened back home, except for perhaps at one point I remember bringing friends from college to my res for my birthday weekend one year, and them being slightly nervous to get out of the car at one point. And I remember that was a huge like shock to me,
Right.
that there are still stereotypes in people's heads,
So,
regardless of the fact that it's 2021.
yeah, Cale, what were they nervous about, do you think?
I think when the media depicts things like you know, roads full of potholes, houses full of boarded up windows and graffiti and things like that, like make no mistake, there are instances of that in the country for
Absolutely.
sure. But I think it's a matter of people thinking that that was just the standard, right?
The norm.
So yeah, and so from you know, traveling, you know, down the highway and then north on County Road 45, it's like you have to wander through this great big forest expansion before you come to what you think is going to be this rundown, dilapidated thing, but is actually quite a thriving little village, I should say. And yeah, it was just really, it was funny to me, and then it was kind of not enraging or anything, like it was just kind of annoying that we had planned this thing for months, and they had never once said anything and then I noticed that they were starting to get tense about getting off the highway and going what they thought to be off the beaten path. So but no, it is 2021. We do have electricity and have had electricity for a long time. So yeah, it's just breaking down the stigma and the stereotypes, I think is super important. And then for them to go home and be like, no, I was being stupid or whatever. And, you know, because even their parents might have had things to say at the time, but.
Yeah. Well, that brings me just to maybe explore a little bit. In an email, I talked to you about settler folk like me wanting to work towards respectful relationships with Indigenous peoples. In my own life, that's a very rich area of growth. I was just talking to my sister, and her Indigenous family has invited me to come and be a part of their family too, which I think is absolutely incredible and very, very humbling. In terms of respectful relationships, what do you think we need more of in our society? Have you seen signs that give you hope? Are there things that feel we're one step forward, one step back? Where are you on all that, Cale?
So I feel like, in terms of my own experience, I have, and I'm sure that everyone, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, goes through peaks and valleys of optimism and pessimism regarding future relations between our people. And I think, like, in terms of, and I'm not obviously able to speak on behalf of an entire nationality of people, but if I was to diagnose or prescribe the situation, I think one thing that I think people, and this goes for any racial relations, I think there needs to be a sense of urgency to stick up for each other, like it shouldn't just be because and this goes across the entirety of Indigenous Peoples Month, or whatever it is they're calling it this year, and I find that there needs to be the majority of people need to be sticking up for the representation of these marginalized groups, in terms of, whether it's jobs or just in being invited to the table kind of thing. And also, if you see oppression happening, I think there needs to be more of the non-oppressed group speaking up about it and calling it out in public and making sure that people understand that it's not okay. When you have things like there was that grandfather out in BC that tried to open that bank account for his daughter, and they arrested him because they thought he was kidnapping her or something like that, and it ended up being a completely racialized incident. Things like that, like how many people were there and didn't say anything, like I think about that all the time. I think about Land Back Lane out in Six Nations, and how many people who are not on the reserve live out there and just watch it happen, kind of thing. So I think there needs to be more sticking up. In terms of just like what can people do on like a regular basis, I think we live in an age where, like you and I aren't even meeting right now in person. Like that's how far technology has come, right? And with that comes a tsunami of information that's just readily available. And I think, when the 215 children were first discovered in Kamloops, I was able to find the Truth and Reconciliation report that was issued back in 2009.
Yep.
Like that, and it took me I Googled what I needed to Google, and it was immediately ready to me. And we live in a time now where the education that people can provide to themselves is more instantaneous than it has ever been. And yet we're still seeing people sort of, I don't want to say lazier than they've ever been on that front, but it kind of, it kind of feels like the finger has never been easier to lift, and yet it's not being lifted. And so I would say to anyone out there who is looking to better their relations on a personal level, just do your education, seek out these people, but also it's also very important that you don't expect the emotional and mental labor of education on our part, like obviously these things are more important to get and probably more accurate to get from people instead of just going and looking at it on the internet. But it's not all, it's also not just our responsibility to make sure that you're educated, right? Like it should be everyone's individual responsibility to make sure that they're doing as much as they can. And it's exhausting, like it's exhausting for anybody to do that sort of work and to unlearn things and relearn things. But I think it's more important now than it ever has been, to do that research, especially as these things are coming to light.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. Cale, is there anything else you want to add around First Peoples Day, Indigenous community, relationships? It's the floor is yours.
Yeah, I mean, it's there hasn't been this year's Indigenous Peoples Month and Day have been certainly unique in my more recent memory, just with the discovery of those unmarked graves, and more will be discovered, no doubt. And so while I think it's important to allow us to grieve, because it is a grieving, because there are people in those graves, like there's children in those graves that within our older generations, like this isn't ancient history. This is, as I saw somewhere where to put it in perspective, the last residential school closed in 1996, while the TV show Friends was airing. Like that's how recent this stuff is in our memory. So it's never been more important to bring this stuff to light. And while it is important for us to be allowed the time to grieve, I think it's also we've never been closer to the truth part of truth and reconciliation. And I think you can't have one without the other, if there is to be something like that at all. And I know a lot of people are saying reconciliation is impossible, but I don't know if I entirely believe that. I think you haven't even gotten to the truth of it yet. We're not as a as a non-Indigenous collection of people even ready to fully admit to what has happened, and so I think we have a long way to go, but I feel like we are on the right track by making sure that regular people like you and me are aware of some of these sort of atrocities and things, so that we can, you can't get rid of an infection without going through some pain, right? And there is certainly an infection under the surface of our sort of collective society in terms of systemic oppression and things like that. So it's gonna hurt on both sides, certainly, but it's necessary. And I'm eventually going to look forward to the good that can come out of bringing these things to light, and the hopeful subsequent education that can happen. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Cale. I invited you to my table and you joined me at it. And I really appreciate that. And I too look forward to the hard work of truth telling. Healing is a process. I remember once a yoga instructor taught me that change happens one cell at a time, as long as we're moving in the direction of the intention of the posture. And so for me, I remain hopeful, but guardedly so. And
Sure.
Hopefully there can be more conversations between people like you and me around a bigger table. And as the Indigenous community grieves, we grieve with you. Thanks, Cale.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Okay.
There is a time that we must rise. There is a time that we must stand. There is a time that we must come together. For blessed are our lives, blessed our love, and blessed the promise gathered now. There is a time that we must leave, go from the place where hatreds breed, and turning feel the Spirit breathe together. For blessed are our lives, blessed our love, and blessed the promise gathered now. Upon the dry, a cloud will rise, and truth will shine among the lies, and wisdom sing as we arise together. Blessed are our lives, blessed our love, and blessed the promise gathered now. There is a bow within a rain, and it will come and again, and colors shine where we have been together. For blessed are our lives, blessed our love, and blessed the promise gathered now.
May our footsteps on these ancient lands remind us of creation and connectedness in our search for truth. May the tree from its roots to its branches remind us to dig deep and reach high in our action for justice. May the eagle who soars in the sky remind us of the power in our call for love. May the expanse of the lands and seas, of the sky and stars, remind us of God's timing in our faith in hope. May the Holy Three, Creator Spirit, Lord God, and Papa Jesus, remind us of community. So go with grace, mercy, and peace. Go in truth, justice, love, and hope. And may the grace of Christ attend you, the love of God surround you, and the Holy Spirit keep you, now and forevermore. Amen.